Good afternoon, everybody. Here I am talking on my phone with the cracked screen. Driving home from work. And I was debating whether I should make a part 2 of my video on why I support the president. But there was another subject that I wanted to discuss earlier. I was speaking to certain Talmud Chacham, a Choshev Rav, about this subject, and I was enlightened by this discussion. I learned something new, proper understanding in a particular passage that I had read somewhat out of context, perhaps, even though I saw it in the original Sefer a number of years ago, but I didn't actually learn it properly, is the way I would say it. And so I wanted to discuss in a certain way the difference between two people who are quite obviously different, although both Orthodox rabbis, both actually coming from Shineva, meaning the Shineva Rav, the Divrei Cheskel, who was the son of the Divrei Chaim, the sons of Rav. The Satmar Rebbe, Zechus Yigaleinu, was in his youth a shtickle chassid of the Shineva Rav. He spent time there. He learned a lot of his derech and avodas Hashem from the Shineva Rav. And someone from a very different approach to Orthodox Judaism, obviously, although who actually, believe it or not, had tremendous respect for the Satmar Rebbe, although he respectfully disagreed with him, was R Meir Kahane. And even though he learned in Litvish yeshivas, he learned in Mir, and he obviously was more in the modern Orthodox world. He wasn't really a yeshivish guy. His father was a more modern Orthodox religious Zionist rabbi, but his grandfather, I believe, was a Shineva Chassid. They were Choshev or Shineva Chassidim, the Kahane family. So that's we know that also the Spinker Rebbe's from the Kahane family. It's a different family, I believe, but it's an interesting piece of history that these two men who came to such different conclusions in their derech and avodas Hashem, both were coming from Shinev and Sons, from the same Makor. They were so close, and yet obviously so different. The Satmar Rebbe being well known for his strong opposition to Zionism, and Meir Kahane being perhaps one of the most extreme religious Zionists, to the point where most of the religious Zionist world strongly disagreed with Meir Kahane's ideology, and to a certain extent, a lot of people didn't like him. Even though, I'll be honest, as much as I believe 100% based on logic, not just because our Rebbe said so, but because it makes sense to me personally, I believe the Satmar Rebbe's approach is the one that makes the most sense personally. But I still love Meir Kahane. I disagreed with him, but still love listening to him every now and then, reading his writings every now and then. Things like that. In any event, the two of them had in a certain sense, the truth is, the Satmar Rebbe's view on a particular issue is perhaps more extreme and could be interpreted it would be certain statements, particularly if taken out of context, and that's what I've been enlightened about, is the proper context. That the Satmar Rebbe's views on a particular issue were more extreme in a certain manner than Meir Kahane's. In a manner that you would expect Meir Kahane to believe. And yet, again, if we turn back around, we can see how ultimately the Satmar Rebbe's views are not extreme at all. They are basic Judaism, and that which makes the most sense, that which is the most logical and sensible approach to Judaism that's possible. And that's particularly when it comes to the issue of the presence of Islamic structures on the Temple Mount. The Mosque of Omar, I believe, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and the Dome of the Rock, which is actually a shrine and not a mosque. There's a sefer that the Satmar Rebbe wrote after the 6-Day War called Al HaGeula V'Al HaTmura, which is a quote from the Book of Ruth. It means concerning the redemption and concerning the exchange. And I believe Meir Kahane also wrote a sefer called Al HaGeula V'Al HaTmura. I'm not sure, but I believe, if I remember properly, there was a book that Meir Kahane wrote by the same title. Or maybe his was Al HaTmura V'Al HaGeula, I'm not sure. I never learned that sefer from Meir Kahane, and I only really briefly learned Al HaGeula from Satmar Rebbe, so I'm not an expert in either of those. But I was discussing with a certain Choshever Rav. He asked me not to mention his name, but he's a nephew of he was ben biased by Satmar Rebbe. He's a nephew of the Satmar Rebbe. And this Rav, I was discussing this question because it didn't really seem to fit in with the ideas and the lashonos that Satmar Rebbe uses are quite interesting. And I'm not saying this in any way to be disrespectful to other religions, but with that being said, there's reasons why we have different religions and why we disagree with one another and why we are not these other larger religions. There's reasons why we're not Muslim, there's reasons why we're not Christian, and so forth. Excuse me. So essentially, a fascinating thing which you could take out of context is that the Satmar Rebbe says one of the biggest sins that the Zionists committed was that they allowed, and he used the term avodah zarah, which usually is colloquially translated as idolatry, which is not an accurate translation. The word avodah zarah simply means a foreign form of worship. So he said one of the greatest sins that the Zionists committed was to allow avodah zarah to remain on the Har HaBayis, on the Temple Mount. So it's fascinating that the Satmar Rebbe calls Islam avodah zarah, although it fits in with the shita of the Shinover Rav and the Sanzer Rav. They adopted this view of certain Rishonim that Islam indeed is under a rubric of avodah zarah. But the term has to be understood as to what does it mean. I think perhaps it's a colloquialism, simply meaning another religion, because obviously the Muslim theology is the same as ours. It's only their ideology that's really different, that they that they believe that we changed the Torah, and they believe in an additional prophet who teaches things that contradict our Torah. Very slight things, not that many things, but little things here and there that the Muslims teach. So we come down to this aspect, what we're discussing here. Essentially, what we find is you would think that the Satmar Rebbe is encouraging people, therefore, to fight against the existence of the Dome of the Rock and things like that, and not only that, but of any presence of other religions in Eretz Yisrael. The fascinating thing about that, which a lot of people would be surprised to hear on the other side, is about Meir Kahane, and that's the type of thing you would expect Meir Kahane to say, right? The truth is, Meir Kahane says, at least about Islam, that Muslims could have a din of ger toshav, and which would include freedom of religion, even under his rubric of a religious state of Israel, or for that matter, his proposed state of Judea. So Meir Kahane is saying Muslims can stay, but they just can't have the right to vote or things like that, or something like that in a Jewish state, which obviously in modern Israel they do have the right to vote and they're equal citizens. And it would seem that Satmar Rebbe would say they can't be practicing any religion other than the Torah. Meaning, so if they're not converting to Judaism, they can't have a religion. They can't worship idols, and they have to believe in one God, and that's it. But a religious structure with beliefs that are different than our own, it would seem that Satmar Rebbe would say it's not acceptable, which it doesn't make any sense. Why would he say that? Doesn't he realize that would start World War III? So it's discussing with this particular Rav this question. He said, I'm essentially misunderstanding what he's saying here. Excuse me, I'm a little tired. I got up early. I didn't sleep much last night. But essentially what we're trying to bring out here is as follows. So what the Satmar Rebbe is essentially saying is that there's a mitzvah, which from last week's parsha mentioned, that when we enter into the Holy Land and conquer the Holy Land, the mitzvah to remove avodah zarah, to remove idolatry from the country, from the land. And if we fail to do so, that's our responsibility. So Satmar Rebbe said, essentially, if it wasn't a Jewish state, we'd have no such responsibility. And so what we'd be saying is that we shouldn't be identifying the state as a Jewish state, and that saves us from the responsibility of removing the avodah zarah from the land, because it's not our business. If we didn't conquer the land, we wouldn't have that mitzvah, and if we wouldn't have that obligation, we wouldn't have the sin of not fulfilling the obligation. But the sin instead that the Satmar Rebbe said, with the state of Israel as a misra dasos, a misra datot, an office of religions. All different religions are represented there. And even it said that the good Yisrael wanted to have representation in the Misra Datot. And Satmar Rebbe said, you crazy? What are you doing? And the thing is, so I run Misra Datot in my prison, but that's neither here nor there. I'm in Golas, right? And that's part of also what the Rashi said last week, etc. Part of being in Golas. But in Eretz Yisrael, we're not supposed to have such a thing. In Eretz Yisrael, it's supposed to, if the Jewish people are in charge of Eretz Yisrael, they have a mitzvah to remove the avodah zarah. So the best way to approach it is not to conquer Eretz Yisrael. That's really what Satmar Rebbe is saying. And then we don't have the achrayus, then we don't have the obligation to remove the avodah zarah. So that's essentially what we're saying here. So, excuse me. So, excuse me for blowing my nose in the camera. I wasn't there. I'm just really tired. But I found that to be very fascinating and enlightening, that part of the reason why we should not be taking over Eretz Yisrael is because once we do that, we open ourselves to certain obligations and responsibilities that we're not able to fulfill. And not only are we not able to fulfill, it's dangerous to fulfill. It puts us in danger. It's a pikuach nefesh issue. And so the best is to just leave well enough alone and not to be involved. And not that we're trying to shirk responsibility or avoid a responsibility. Rather because we know what the responsibility entails. And it's something that's too dangerous for us to engage in at the moment, because it's going to start World War III, God forbid, if we would do such a thing. We're not. It's not our job to do this right now. We are in Golas. It's part of what exile, what the Golas is all about. And in a certain sense, we are serving the Avodah Zarah. And there's a purpose in that as well. That by offering this service to the world, we're making the world a better place by being exiled and by having this responsibility in the world. So Eibishter soll helfen, that we should find a peaceful way to live and not antagonize our neighbors and not hate them, and recognize that we are in exile and that there's a purpose in the exile, and that God has a plan for us in the exile, and it's to make the whole world a better place. And I would go so far as to say, and personally, I don't think that Islam is a Avodah Zarah, and I don't think Satmar Rebbe really thought that. I think perhaps he was just using the colloquialism there and not making necessarily a halachic statement about the status of Islam. I do agree with R Meir Kahane on the more moderate point that in theory a Muslim could have the din of a ger toshev, and he would not have to give up his particular form of worshiping the one God, the Creator, like how the Rambam says that libam l'shamayim, that their heart is to heaven, and that we do worship the same God. It's not like you read in the little comic books from Chick about they're worshiping a moon god or something. The Rambam says clearly their ancestors worshipped idols, but when it comes to Muslims today, libam l'shamayim. And I don't think he was just saying that out of fear of retribution because he lived in a Muslim country, but rather he said this because he really believed it. So, and so therefore I'm showing you that I'm not blindly following what the Satmar Rebbe says. But with that being said, it certainly makes much more sense that we are not in a Jewish state, so we don't have this question of the of having to remove Avodah Zarah from Eretz Yisrael and things like that, because it's not our job. We are in exile, and our job is to be involved with other things at the moment. And I think often of the story I saw in the PragerU video about the British colonialists in India, and how British colonialism made India a much better place, because the example that was given was that the custom was to burn widows in India. And the British general told the Hindu priests that we will respect your custom of burning widows if you'll respect our custom of hanging men who burn innocent widows. So that's the story, and so therefore the practice more or less came to an end, and which I think is a positive development in India. They can still keep their traditional religion without murdering people, and so too, that would be the same message we have to other religions. Say certain terrorists or something. We don't have an issue with you praying 5 times a day. We don't have an issue with you eating halal meat and this and that, and reciting the Quran and this. But anybody who's going to engage in murderous activities, terrorist activities, honor killings, things like that. There's no place for that in polite society, just like in the Jewish world. We're not killing a Ben Sarmar, we're not killing a Molech, we're not knocking down temples of idolatry, we're not removing idols and so or other religions from Israel, because we're not supposed to. We're not supposed to have a Jewish state right now. And so we seek to avoid such responsibilities by living in a more peaceful way. And then when Mashiach comes, we won't need to do any kind of violent attacks on any other religions, because we won't. The Bible tells us that we will not have to tell anybody about God, because they will all know about God, from the least of them to the greatest of them, because the knowledge of the Lord will cover the earth as the waters cover the seas. And we're looking forward to that day with this Galus Kvit Shemayim and the Haramas Karen the Tervi Yisrael B'mei Remain Amen.